Good morning and welcome to our series in Daniel, the devotional series we're doing during the lockdown, and we're now all the way on Daniel chapter 11, and it's a very interesting chapter. We're not going to cover the whole chapter, we're just going to cover the first 35 verses of Daniel 11, and there's going to be a reason for that, and you'll see that as we go and make our way. But we started all the way with Daniel, who was a young Jewish boy, probably part of a royal part of the royal family in some way, and being about 15 years old, was taken to Babylon in chapter 1 and had to learn the culture, the language of being in Babylon while still setting his mind to obey the law of God. And we've seen through this, there's been a significant number of prophecies that talk about beyond Daniel's time and into the nations that have ruled the known world as it relates to Israel. That's really all that matters in God's history. It doesn't mean that nations don't matter. It doesn't mean that Chinese dynasties don't matter, or what was happening with the Aztecs, the Incas in Central America don't matter. Of course they do. All people matter to God. But as it relates to God's revelation of who he is through his people, that's where the histories are centralized. And that's why they're recorded in Scripture, not because they're worth more than other people, but because they reveal something about God, because they talk about how God is with the people of his covenant and how he relates to that. And that's why we have this in here. Now, if that's in your mind, and then you begin to understand that, then much of Daniel comes clear as we understood the prophecies of Daniel 7, Daniel 8, Daniel 9, and Daniel 10 that we just did yesterday. And now we're into the actual revelation of what this prophecy is in Daniel chapter 11. And going back as well to the previous chapters, remember it was the statue and then the animals in chapter 7, some smaller animals, but chapter 8, that's a lot what we're going to deal with today, is defining what's going on in chapter 8 with the persecution of Israel just before the time of Christ. And that's what this Daniel chapter 11 is. Well, if your Bibles are open to Daniel chapter 11, I'll just tell you, as I remember reading this long ago, early as a Christian, and even as a young boy, reading some of this, I mistakenly thought this is about like all of world history. It's like a prophecy that tells us all of what's going to be happening all the way to the end and the Antichrist. And I don't think we should read it that way. The first 35 verses that we're going to have deal very specifically with two dynasties that are fighting, and Israel happens to be right in the middle of their battles. And that's why they're shown there. So all these kings and all that is not demonstrating what's going to be happening, so we don't want to impose any kind of 20th century perspective on these and invent who the kings of the north and the south are and all of that. No, it's very clear and historically 100% accurate as to what happened here. And I want to show this to you all the way to verse 35, and then there's going to be a break. We go to verse 36, and I'll explain to you why we're going to do that. But let's get going here in Daniel chapter 11, and if your Bibles are open, you can just mark them. This is so that you can really go back and learn and understand Daniel here. Remember yesterday, Daniel 10, an angel came and gave Daniel a message. He'd been praying for 21 days. And he said, well, I was withheld by the prince of Persia. The angel who's over the Persian government was standing against this particular angel to give a message to Daniel. And Michael, the archangel, had to come help him and somehow released him to be able to come give this message to Daniel. And we don't know exactly what that withstanding was or why, or were they actually physically fighting, or was it because the angel had to wait for Michael to take his place before he could come? We don't know exactly, but we know it was a hindrance. That's what we do know. And he did come, and he said, I got to go back now and deal with the princes of Persia and still fight for them as well. And then the prince of Greece is going to come, meaning here comes another demonic angel, another situation where this demonic ruling power is going to come with the Gentile forces. And we believe in chapter 10 where it says princes of, it's not talking about the kings, it's talking about the princes who are behind the kings, because that's who this angel was fighting there in verse 13. So now we get ourselves to chapter 11, verse 1. And actually, chapter 11, verse 1 belongs to yesterday's lesson. We'll just read it here. In the first year of Darius the Mede, I arose to be an encouragement and protection for him. I is the messenger, the angel that was speaking in chapter 10 to Daniel, those last verses. Maybe he's Gabriel, we don't know for sure. But in the first year of Darius the Mede, notice that, mark that. When is the first year of Darius the Mede? Well, it's 2 years before, because we're now in the third year of Cyrus the Persian. That's chapter 10. Well, Darius and Cyrus were together. They were working together. And so the first year of Darius is the first year of Cyrus. So the first year of Darius the Mede here is also the first year of Cyrus, which puts it 2 years before this period took place. And what this angel is saying is, in the first year of Darius the Mede, I arose to be an encouragement and a protection for him. Notice the him there. Who is him? The closest person that him could relate to is going to be Michael in verse 21 of chapter 10. So in the same way that Michael came to help this angel against the princes of Persia, against the fighting against the prince of Persia, Michael came to help him just create a balance or withstand him. In the same way, 2 years before, he went to help Michael. And Michael is the angel over Israel. That's what the text says. He says in verse 21 of chapter 10, Michael, your prince, he is. And chapter 12, verse 6 says the same thing. Michael stands guard over your people. I think we can see that in chapter 12, verse 6. Chapter 12, verse 1, excuse me. That Michael, the great prince who stands guard over the sons of your people, chapter 12, verse 1. Well, so we see in the first year of Darius the Mede, that's 2 years before, he went to go help Michael, to be a protection and encouragement for him, as he is protecting the Jews. He's trying to get the Jews going. Why? Well, what happened 2 years before? Cyrus's decree, that's what happened. Cyrus decreed Israel to go back to Jerusalem, and Michael, who stands guard over those people, is going to work to enact God's will to move and get them going to Jerusalem, using whatever means to minister to these people that Michael would do. We know this from Hebrews chapter 13 too, that angels are ministering spirits. We encounter angels without knowing it. Some will entertain angels. Angels are meant to minister to us. Well, they did for Israel as well. And so this is what happens, as he's saying. These angels were working together for Israel in particular. So we get to verse 2 then, and now this is the prophecy. This is actually what the angel has told Daniel. He says, I'm going to tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings are going to arise in Persia. So after the one you've got, Cyrus, after Cyrus, there's 3 more kings. Then a 4th will gain far more riches than all of them. And as soon as he becomes strong through his riches, he'll arouse the whole empire against the realm of Greece. This historically happened. There were 3 kings. And then came Xerxes, beginning with an X, Xerxes. And he was the richest of all the Persian kings. And he set a huge military campaign against Greece. This is what he did. And so he went to go do that. That's verse 2. So that's a historical thing that happened. And a mighty king will arise, verse 3. And he'll rule with great authority and do as he pleases. This is very clear. It's Alexander the Great. Everybody who interprets Scripture says this is Alexander the Great, because we see from verse 4, as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 points of the compass, though not to his own descendants. Not according to his authority which he wielded, for his sovereignty will be uprooted and given to others besides them. Now just understand how history moves. The time frame from 3 more kings are going to rise in Persia, verse 2, the starting point is where Daniel is, 538 BC. 538 to 536 BC, that's Daniel's starting point. That's where he is from there. Now, when this mighty king arises, that's going to be right around 336 BC or so. So it's going to be almost 200 years of Persian king rule, and he's only telling us about 4 of them. There were 9 Persian kings. He's only telling us about 3, and then he gets to the 4th, who uses his wealth to go against Greece. Now that's important. Why? Well, because it brings in the Greek kingdom. That's what's important. What happens and who's ruling and who's good and who's bad, that's not important. Because he's telling us how history is going to happen. But what about Artaxerxes, who came after Xerxes, and he dealt with Nehemiah and Ezra? Yeah, I know. That's what happened, but that's not what the prophecy's about. This prophecy is not about getting back to Jerusalem and building the temple. That's already happening under Cyrus's decree. What this prophecy is about is what's going to happen in the great persecution of Daniel chapter 8. That's what this prophecy is going to demonstrate and show. And so we get to the king of Greece, and he dies. He gives his kingdom out to 4 generals. And I'll just name them here for you. One's called Cassandra. The other's called Lysimachus. Another one is Ptolemy the First. Ptolemy with a P, Ptolemy the First Soter, and Seleucus the First Nicator. Those are 4 guys. You can check them up on Google and see who they are. But they divided up his kingdom, those 4 areas. This prophecy is only dealing with 2 of those generals and their descendants, armies and cities. The Ptolemies and the Seleucids, those 2. The Ptolemies is Egypt, the south. That would be the king of the south all the time, the Ptolemy. And then the Seleucids would be up in the Syria, Babylon range there that included Israel in there. So you can see between the Middle East, Syria, Jordan, where that is now, Iraq, all those places, that would be the Seleucids. Egypt and all coming up to where the Philistines are, that would be the Ptolemies. And guess who's right in the middle? Israel and Jerusalem, right smack in the middle where these 2 are fighting it out. And so these 4 generals in verse 4 have taken the kingdom from Alexander the Great. It took about 20 years to get that situated. Then what we've got now, I just want to show you from verses 5 to 12, the Egyptian Ptolemies are the ones who dominated. They're the ones who really kind of ruled. And so we see verse 5 right away. The king of the south, Ptolemy I, he grew strong, along with one of his princes who will gain ascendancy over him and obtain dominion. So it talks about how they got stronger. Verse 6, after some years they'll form an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north and carry out a peaceful arrangement. They began to work together, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, and we'll see this again in a very important aspect of a name that is familiar to you. But in this case, there's a daughter of a king, and her name was Bernice, and they tried to work an alliance. So basically, the Seleucids, the king of Syria, tried to get his daughter to come marry the king of Egypt, and then they would have an alliance. The problem was the king of Egypt was already married, and his wife didn't like that, so she waited till they married and had a son, and she killed all of them. And so that's literally what happened. And so they form an alliance. The daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north, carry out a peaceful arrangement, but she'll not retain a position of power, nor will he remain with his power. She'll be given up, along with those who brought her in, the one who sired her, as well as he who supported her in those times. Everybody's dead. That's what happened. It just got real messy in there. So they tried to do a marriage arrangement. That didn't work. And so then we turn to verse 7, and again we're in the Ptolemies. One of the descendants of her line will arise in his place. Her brother kind of came up and then said, I'm going to go fight against the Syria, the king of the north, and that. And he'll deal with them and display great strength. So they're pressing on, verses 8 all the way down through, really verse 12 is the last victories that came. But I want you to notice in verse 10, you can write this down in your Bible, verse 10, the king of the north, it says, his sons will mobilize and assemble a multitude of great forces. This is talking about the king of the north, because verse 8 has the king of the north, Egypt is going to stop attacking the Syrians from the north for some years. Then the latter, that would be the Syrians, will enter the realm of the king of the south, but return to his own land. Okay? So they're trying to kind of probe back and forth. And so his sons, the sons specifically, and I've got my notes right here, a guy by the name of Seleucus Seleucus III, he's the one that went and came back. He had some sons. Or actually Seleucus II had sons, and one was Seleucus III, and the other was Antiochus III. Now, this Seleucus III died after a couple of years, and his brother Antiochus took over and began running things. And he ran things for quite some time, probably 30 some odd years. It says in verse 10, he'll mobilize and assemble a multitude of great forces, which he did. So he's now geared up. Remember, the Ptolemies, the Egyptians, are the ones that are dominating. So this guy Antiochus III from the Syrian side, he's coming down to fight. So verse 11, the king of the south will be enraged. Go fight with Antiochus III. He's going to do that. And so the latter will raise a great multitude. But that multitude will be given into his hand to the former. So that means Antiochus had a great multitude, and history records this. They had huge armies. And these were armies of 70 and 100,000 soldiers on the battlefield each, along with chariots and all that, and elephants. These are the guys who fought with elephants. And Antiochus III was a very strong, he was called Antiochus the Great. And he had as one of his advisors a famous general from Carthage named Hannibal. Hannibal the Great. And there's poems written about Hannibal. You know, when Hannibal is at the gates, everybody trembles. That's who we fear, that's who we hate. It's Hannibal the Great. When he comes to the gates with his elephants, and they come in and they press and they beat. So you had all these armies with elephants and soldiers that just came. And that's verse 11 with this huge multitude. But he didn't win. Actually, the Ptolemy IV wins. But verse 12 says, when they carried everybody away, his heart was lifted up, and he'll cause tens of thousands to fall, yet his pride was his undoing, and that was the end of the Ptolemy dominance right there. So this is all happening still about 30 years before the evil, wicked little horn of Antiochus Epiphanes. So it's right about 200 BC that this is happening. And so then we get to verse 13, and we see the king of the north will again raise a greater multitude. This is Antiochus III again. And now he's not giving up, and he's coming after them. And he comes in with a great army and much equipment, it says. Now remember, he had Hannibal as his advisor, who is noted as one of the, along with Alexander the Great, he's one of the top military generals in all of world history. And verse 14, now in those times many will rise up against the king of the south, and the violent ones among your people will also lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they will fall down. These are people who were Jews that did away with their Jewish following and following the law, and they joined in the campaign here in their politics, and they will fall down. So here comes Antiochus III in verse 15, the king of the north. He's going to come, cast up a siege ramp, capture a well-fortified city. And here he goes, and he is now on his campaign, and the Ptolemies can't stand against him. They'll stand their ground, but not even their choicest troops, for there'll be no strength to make a stand. But he who comes against him will do as he pleases, and no one will be able to withstand him. He will also say, for a time in the beautiful land, and destruction in his hand. So he actually stayed in Palestine, he stayed in Jerusalem, and he plundered the temple. And so he caused, again, this is where persecutions began to happen. Remember in Daniel chapter 8, the 2300 evenings and mornings, here it comes. And it's coming, and it starts with Antiochus III. And then He will turn his face to the coastlands, verse 18, and capture many. But a commander will put a stop to his scorn against him. Moreover, he will pay him for his scorn. What happened to Antiochus III? The Romans came, because the Ptolemies appealed to Rome, and they came and they put a stop to it. So Rome was seeing him as a threat, so they came and they stopped him. So he got so upset, he turned his face toward the fortresses of his own land, but he'll stumble and fall and be found no more. He ended up having to go back to his own people and say, Rome has imposed on us a payment for all the damage I've caused, and they ended up killing him. And so his son took his place. Antiochus III died, and his son took his place. Verse 20, then in his place one will arise who will send an oppressor through the jewel of his kingdom. He sent a man to collect money from all the people in Jerusalem, in the temple, to collect money to pay Rome. Yet within his few days he will be shattered, though not in anger nor in battle. So what in anger, what in battle, and he was killed by people because he was just plundering and taking the money so he could pay Rome. And that left then, in verse 21, the next person to take his place, and notice the words here, verse 21, in his place a despicable person will arise. That's Antiochus IV Epiphanes. That's the little horn in Daniel. That's a despicable person, on whom the honor of kingship has not been conferred. He took the throne, but it wasn't his, because it should have gone to the son of the guy who died in verse 20. So the guy who died in verse 20, specifically, his name was Seleucus IV Philopater. Seleucus IV Philopater. And he was collecting the money, and he died. Well, he had a son. His son is now supposed to be king, but his son was actually off in a Roman prison. He was taken captive by Rome. And so Antiochus used some intrigue here to work his way in and win favor with the people in Syria, and he became their king. He didn't have the royal blood, but he took it. And he'll come at a time of tranquility and seize the kingdom by intrigue. And so the overflowing forces will be flooded away before him and shattered, and also the prince of the covenant. So he defeated the Ptolemies, and so much so that he worked it out. When he defeated the guy who was king of Egypt, verse 23 says, he tries to make an alliance with him to get the guy to work for him, and said, okay, we'll set you up as king in Egypt if you fight with me. So they made an alliance, practiced deception, and they wanted to go fight. Now, verse 24, a time of tranquility, he'll enter the richest parts of the realm. He'll accomplish what his father never did. He'll distribute plunder and booty. So this is a time when he was plundering Egypt, and he was distributing out, buying favors, but it will only work for a time, verse 24 says. And so verse 25 is now 169 BC. It's a few years before he really goes in to desecrate the temple, and he has a campaign against Egypt. And so in verse 25, he'll stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south. So now he's going with a large army against Egypt, the king of the south, which is Ptolemy the Sixth. He's going up against him, mobilizing this large army for war, but he will not stand, for schemes will be devised against him. And those who eat his choice food will destroy him, his army will overflow, but many will fall down slain. And so the king of the south, Ptolemy, he can't stand against this guy. His own people were devising schemes against him. These were his own people. So I know it's confusing in there to find out who's winning and who's losing, but the king of the north is the one who's winning, Antiochus Epiphanes. He's really on a roll here. King of the south is a kind of an inept leader. And so he takes him, but again, never wanted to let a crisis go to waste. Verse 27, as for both kings, their hearts will be intent on evil, and they will speak lies to each other at the same table, but it will not succeed, for the end is still to come at the appointed time. One defeated the other in a battle, but they both saw how you can help me and I can help you. And so they had a dinner, and changed lies, and neither one believed what the other one said. And both of them were lying to each other. The king of Syria was saying, okay, if you fight with me, I'll set you up as king. And the king of Egypt was saying, okay, if you help me up as king, I'll support you. Both were lying. This is recorded in history. They did this. And so he returned to his own land in verse 28 with much plunder, but his heart will be set against the holy covenant, and he will take action and return to his own land. So now he went back, and going through Syria, he was angry. He saw much plunder. He went right to the temple, and he took it again. And so now we get to 168 BC, and he's trying one more time to go back to Egypt. Because Egypt kept getting rich, and once they get rich, you go down and you plunder. And that's what they were doing all the time, trying to go down and plunder. So at the appointed time, verse 29, he'll return and come into the south, but this last time it will not turn out the way it did before, for ships of Kittim will come against him. Therefore he'll be disheartened, will return, become enraged at the Holy Covenant, and take action. So he'll come back and show regard for those who forsake the Holy Covenant. 29 and 30 is him going down to Egypt one more time to get a major plunder, because he won last time. He figured he could do it again. And so he went to go again, but it didn't turn out the way before. Why? Roman ships came and they stopped him. The Egyptian Ptolemies went to Rome and said, you got to help us here. This guy's coming down. So they sent their ships down, and Antiochus was there. And a few miles outside of the city, the Roman general met Antiochus and gave him a letter that said, you better not even think about coming after the Ptolemies here. You better not think about it. The letter said, if you make a move against this city, you are at war with Rome. And he handed him a letter. And then this Roman general drew a circle in the sand around Antiochus Epiphanes. So he dug a circle. While he was sitting there, his armies are all there, and the ships are all there, so they got him outnumbered. And this Roman general drew a circle around Antiochus. He said, now, you better respond before you step outside this circle. Otherwise, we got war. So you could see that Antiochus was immensely humiliated by the Roman army here in this great show of force. So he became enraged at the Holy Covenant, took action, he came back, and he began to then just wipe out the temple, killed thousands of Jews, implemented Greek culture everywhere, and he begins to set up his own set of worship there. So when these Roman ships stopped him and humiliated him, he went back to take it out all on Israel and Jerusalem. And then verse 31, forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary forces, and do away with the regular sacrifice, and they will set up the abomination of desolation. Do you remember that? Remember that when we saw that in Daniel chapter 8, so that we see that what he wants to do, in verse 25 of Daniel chapter 7, chapter 7, verse 25, he will intend to make alterations in times and law, and they'll be given into his hand. And so we see this tremendous hatred for the Jews, and he will try to desecrate all worship, the temples, and all of this. And so that's what is here in Daniel chapter 8, beginning in Daniel chapter 8, verse 21, begins with the kingdom of Greece and goes all the way down to verse 26. So we see the same kind of thing happening here, that he is completely desecrating the temple, creating an abomination of desolation. And then he says in verse 32, by smooth words he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant. But the people who know their God will display strength and take action. There's going to be a struggle. There's going to be those who stay true to their God, and there's going to be those who side with the politics, and they side with where the strength is. And they say they're Jewish just kind of by heritage. Even when they fall, they'll be granted a little help, and many will join them with hypocrisy. So when the Maccabean revolt came, some people joined them, But they weren't really joining them because they believed in God. They just joined them because it was going to suit their purposes. So there were some Jews who joined the Maccabees in hypocrisy, as they had this fight with Antiochus Epiphanes, and the Seleucids were there, and the Maccabees came. That's what this is all about right here. Some of those who have insight will fall in order to refine, purge, and make them pure until the end time, when it is still to come at the appointed time. What's the end time, the appointed time? This is not the end of history. The end time, appointed time, is not the end of the age. It is not after the Great Tribulation and all that. The end time, the appointed time, is what we see in Daniel chapter 8, which is the time that the temple is through being desecrated and the temple is cleansed, purified, and it's now back in order. And that's what happened with Hanukkah. Hanukkah was the purification of the temple after this period. So all of these verses here that take us to verse 31 is all about what takes us all the way to what was happening in Daniel chapter 8. Now, why would he only give us that? Well, because that was the prophecy that Daniel was given in chapter 8 that is explained. That is what's happening to your holy people, Daniel, as you move all the way up to Christ in Daniel chapter 9, as we're moving toward Messiah the Prince, those 483 years coming. This is describing those 483 years of what that's going to be like. What's next, though? What's in verse 36 that we skip? Why do we stop? Because we stop right here, coming up. This is the history going up to the 483 years. Because right after this, the Maccabean revolt, just 100 years later, we're talking about Christ. Maybe 150 years later, now we're talking about Christ coming in. So the governments are all set up, and it's defining that history. And then verse 36 does something. And I'm going to show you. It jumps all the way to the 70th week of Daniel, chapter 9. It jumps all the way there. And now we're talking about that week. Why would the angel give this kind of prophecy? Well, because that was the prophecy in Daniel 9. There's nothing in between that matters for Israel. Between the 69th and the 70th week, there's nothing that matters for Israel. Why? It's the times of the Gentiles. Romans chapter 11, verse 25. I tell you a mystery. It says a partial blindness and hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in, and then all Israel will be saved. In this way, all Israel will be saved. So there's a time of the Gentiles, which means it's not about Israel, Daniel. It's not about you and your people. But it is all the way up to the prophecy of Daniel chapter 8, the abomination of desolation that happens there. And then what happens? Well, we have Gentiles. Well, what happens then in verse 36 as we come? Well, we pick up the abomination of desolation right there again and pick it up, but it's a new one that hasn't happened yet. Remember, I've told you that it hadn't happened because Jesus said in Matthew chapter 24, I think it's verse 15, that said, when you see the abomination of desolation prophesied by the prophet Daniel, you better run for the hills. That means it's coming. That means the abomination of desolation is coming in the temple for Israel. It's coming. And I'm going to show you where that talks about that from verse 36 on, all the way to the end of the chapter. So tomorrow we're going to deal with verse 36 of chapter 11 all the way to end of chapter 12 to say, now what's he talking about? And how does that get us to the end? And we'll deal with that. But for this, we can see that, I want to tell you that this prophecy here, it's helped a very difficult chapter. There's a lot of history and just kings of the north and the south. It's not about world history. It's about the history that reveals God's truth as it relates to God's people. So it tells us something about God and his faithfulness, his people and his covenant. It's not about whether China or Russia or the United States or England or who's going to do what to whom. It has nothing to do with that. And it's not that those people aren't important. It's that they don't tell us about any revelation about God, who he is, and his people, because promises were not made to them. Promises were made to Israel. This is about how those promises are working out. And so that's why this prophecy was given to Daniel, for him and his people. So, quick way to read it. Verse 1 really belongs before. It's the angel saying, I was even working with Michael 2 years ago. Verse 2, well, let's start talking about the kings of Persia. The fourth one is the big one because he goes against Greece. 200 years later, Alexander the Great comes on the scene. He dies after about 10 or 15 years of being in power. His four generals get his all his land and conquerings, and they split up. Two are the ones that matter because they're the ones who deal with Israel. The other two are in other parts of the earth dealing with all kinds of other people but have nothing to do with God's revelation. But the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, the Syrians and the Egyptians, and Israel in between, and everybody going back and forth fighting, that's what verses 2 through 35 are about. Verses 2 through 12, the Ptolemies kind of have the leverage and they're winning. Verses 13 through 35, that's the Seleucids. And the last one's from actually 25 all the way to the 35, that is Antiochus Epiphanes. I do want to give you one last thing here, and I'll explain it to you. That Antiochus III the Great, he was the guy who started there in verse 10. He was one of the sons who began out here. Well, in his rule, I just want to tell you, in his rule, and he tried to work out some things with his Ptolemy enemy, and so when they're putting things together and they're working things out, Antiochus III had his daughter, whose name was Cleopatra, go and marry the Ptolemy king of the south. And so he did this in verse 17. In verse 17, he'll set his face to come with the power of his whole kingdom, bringing with him a proposal of peace. So this time, instead of coming with his elephants and all his war, he came to the Ptolemies with peace, which he will put into effect. And he'll give him the daughter of women to ruin it. So I'm going to give you my daughter Cleopatra to the king of Egypt. And they're going to get together. And now we'll be united, and I will be able to control Egypt because my daughter is there. What ended up happening is the daughter turned against her father, went with her husband, and she essentially became with Egypt. And that's why it says here that she will not take a stand for him or be on his side. So Antiochus III, in the middle of this, when the Seleucids were getting power, he tried to cut a deal with the Egyptians. Cleopatra's daughter, she turned against her father, went with her husband. They fought more, and what ended up happening was Antiochus Epiphanes slipped in the cracks, and the greatest persecutor of Israel came on the scene right there. That's what happened from verses 2 to verse 35. So that's kind of the action-packed thing that's happening here. I know it's tough to keep up with the names and the players, but if you can just remember the two generals, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. Verses 2 to 12 is the Ptolemies were winning, and then verses 13 to 35, the Seleucids were winning, and verse 25 to 35 is Antiochus, that evil, wicked person who killed so many Jews and desecrated the temple, came into play. All of that is telling Daniel play by play what's happening in Daniel chapter 8. Then we're going to get to Daniel verse 36 on, and that's going to be, what does that 70th week look like? So he gave Daniel the prophecy of what it's going to look like for Israel up to the 69th week. Nothing for a long time because it doesn't involve Israel. It's the time of the Gentiles. And then the 70th week kicks in, and now we're going to get a play-by-play on that. That's for tomorrow as we finish the book of Daniel. Tomorrow in Daniel chapter 11, verse 36 to Daniel 12. We'll see you then. Thank you.